The year was 1786. A guard turned a key with tired fingers. The cell door groaned open, and somewhere deep inside a wooden bucket, a rat, small, grey, and missing a patch of fur, scurried off with the last bite of a bread crust. It was morning, or at least, the kind of morning one gets in an 18th century American prison, where sunlight didn't so much pour in as it filtered through thick iron bars and drifted like dust through stale air. The kind of air that knew the smell of wet wool, rotten meat, unwashed feet, and the thick sour breath of 100 men sleeping too close together. Before breakfast even arrived, the smell of it was already here. You see, in 1786, prisons didn't have cafeterias. They didn't have menus. They barely had kitchens. And yet every day, just like clockwork, something they called food was pushed, poured, or shoveled into bowls and handed through iron gates. Something warm, or at least lukewarm. Something brown. Something that, depending on who you asked, was either better than nothing, or a new kind of punishment altogether. But before we peer into the bowl, we need to step back. Because by 1786, America had just recently finished its revolution. The war was over. The country was young. But the prisons, they were already old. Many of them were little more than stone cellars under courthouses, or repurposed military forts, or crumbling jails that smelled of mold and sounded like coughing. There were no rehabilitation programs, no guards with body cameras, and certainly no federal food regulations. And the people locked inside. Some had murdered. Some had stolen a handkerchief. Some owed debts so small that today they wouldn't even make a parking ticket. But to the men who ran these jails, they were all the same thing. Mouths to feed. And mouths, back then, cost money. In most prisons, breakfast came first, not because it was the most important meal of the day, but because it was the easiest to forget later. It was often just mush. Not porridge, not oatmeal. Just mush. Made from cornmeal or rye flour, boiled down with water until it reached the consistency of regret. If you were lucky, it had salt. If you were unlucky, it had insects. In some cities, you might be given a heel of bread alongside it, but only if the shipment had arrived on time, and only if the jailer hadn't already sold most of it for pocket change at the market. Because corruption wasn't a risk in 1786, it was how most things worked. And no one, absolutely no one, kept track of how many loaves made it from the bakery to the block. As for the bread itself, it wasn't exactly soft. In fact, many prisoners had to soak their bread in their mush just to chew it. Those without teeth, they simply went hungry or gummed it until it turned to paste. One prisoner in Philadelphia wrote that breakfast tasted of dirt, dust, and discouragement. Another recalled it as the only thing duller than the sermons. And a third, held in a New York jail, claimed he traded his mush for shoe polish, as both had the same flavor, and the latter at least made the boots shine. Not every jail was equal. In smaller towns, prisoners might be fed directly by the jailer's wife, who cooked in her own kitchen, just feet away from the cells. That could mean boiled eggs, a slice of salted pork, maybe even stew. But it could also mean scraps, leftovers, and spoiled potatoes no one else wanted to touch. And it wasn't just the food. It was how it was delivered. Prisoners didn't line up with trays. They didn't walk past sneeze guards. Meals were passed through slits in the bars, or ladled into wooden bowls that hadn't been washed in weeks, or dropped onto the floor in front of a cell, where mice and men scrambled for the first bite. There were no forks, no spoons, just fingers and hunger. Sometimes, inmates shared bowls. Not because it was encouraged, but because it was expected. You were meant to be grateful you were fed at all. After all, this was a time when some Americans still believed that hunger made a man righteous. That suffering built character. And that punishment was supposed to feel like punishment. Still, for all its flaws, there was a rhythm to it. Breakfast came in the morning. Always hot, or at least, once hot. Always bland. Always forgettable. But for the men behind those bars, it was the only thing that told them the day had begun. It was a signal. A sign that they had survived one more night. That the jail still stood. That time, no matter how slow, still moved. And it was only the beginning. Because if you thought breakfast was bleak, just wait until you see what they served for dinner. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the smell of something cooking, if one could call it that, had begun to drift through the stone corridors of the jail. In most American cities in 1786, breakfast wasn't a joyous occasion for inmates. It was a requirement, a ritual, a routine. But don't picture steaming stacks of flapjacks or eggs sizzling in cast-iron pans. Instead, imagine a wooden ladle scraping the bottom of a blackened kettle. Imagine gruel, thin, beige, and always lukewarm. In most urban jails, especially in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston, breakfast for prisoners consisted of mush, a watery blend of cornmeal and water, boiled until it thickened just enough to slide reluctantly from spoon to bowl. Sometimes it was called hasty pudding. But this name was generous. Sugar? No. Milk? Rare. Butter? Never. The only flavor was the faint bitterness of overcooked grains and the occasional crunch of something unidentifiable that had made its way into the pot. The cook, often a prisoner himself or a lower-paid jail servant, stirred the mush with a stick that had once been a broom handle. The cauldron it was prepared in might not have been cleaned in days. Or weeks. And yet, to the famished, it was something. Prisoners rose from straw-stuffed mattresses, or simply the bare floor, when the bell clanged. A single bell tied to a rope. Its sound was dull, echoing across stone and brick and into their bones. They lined up, iron shackles clinking softly, their eyes hollow and their bodies stiff. Some whispered to themselves. Some prayed. Others simply stared forward, resigned to the rhythm of their captivity. The bowls used for breakfast were not uniform. Some were made of pewter, others of wood, and a few men used makeshift containers, broken cups or even scraps of leather curled into shallow cups. Each prisoner held his own as he stepped forward. And the portions? Always small. A half scoop. That was it. You could eat it in 5 bites. And you probably would. This wasn't about comfort or nourishment. It was about survival. Keeping men alive, but just barely. And if the jailer was in a foul mood, or if the kitchen was short on cornmeal, the portions would shrink even more. Occasionally, if a farmer or local merchant had donated old bread, prisoners might be handed a chunk alongside their mush. The bread was always stale, hard as a rock, and often moldy. But most would eat it without hesitation. A few would barter for it. Bread had value. Bread could be traded for tobacco, or for protection, or for secrets. The wealthy prisoners fared differently. Even in the grim shadows of 18th century justice, money spoke. A debtor from a respected family might be allowed to bring his own food. A tray covered in cloth would arrive from home. A slice of cured meat, perhaps a boiled egg, a roll baked that morning. And the other prisoners would watch. Not jealously, but with a certain hollowness. As if looking at a painting of food. Something beautiful. Untouchable. Sometimes these wealthier inmates would share. More often they would not. Prison had a way of hardening even the softest hands. But no one, not even the richest man in the jail, could escape the sounds. The slurp of mush. The teeth crunching stale crust. The dry coughs from bread swallowed too fast. And then, silence. After breakfast, there was nothing to do but wait. For chores. For trials. For freedom. Or for death. Because in 1786, American prisons were not machines of reform. They were holding pens. And breakfast wasn't about hope. It was a reminder that you were still here, that you had made it through one more night, and that another would follow. It wasn't just about what you were served, it was also how you ate it. Even behind prison walls in 1786, there were rules. Not just rules from the guards, but unwritten rules whispered between cellmates and carved into wooden bunks with dirty fingernails. For one, you didn't eat too fast. Not because anyone cared about manners, but because if you finished before the others, you might be asked to share. And generosity was a dangerous currency. Each meal arrived like a riddle. Was that meat really meat? Did the bread move? Or was that your imagination? And why did everything, even water, seem to smell faintly of something burnt? Some prisoners learned to trade. A crust of bread for a rag blanket, a turnip for a story, and in rare cases, a single boiled bean for a promise of protection during the night. There were customs, too. For instance, if your cellmate died, which happened more often than anyone liked to mention, the guards would sometimes leave the body there for hours. And if the dead man still had food, well, let's just say hunger made even the holy reconsider their vows. And then there were punishments. Some jails operated on the bread and water method, but not all bread was equal. Some loaves were as hard as bricks, and inmates had to break them by smashing them on the stone floor or gnawing at them like wolves with weak teeth. Water wasn't always fresh either. Cisterns were rarely cleaned, and the wooden buckets used to scoop and pour had mold growing in rings like tree lines, reminding you how long it had been since they'd last been scrubbed. Guards, meanwhile, held power over portions. One wrong word, one sideways glance, and your bowl might arrive only half full. Or not at all. And that's when the real negotiations began. Some begged. Some threatened. Some sang lullabies to mice just to stay sane. And yet, in the midst of it all, routines developed. There was the man who always offered the first bite to a rat who lived under his bunk. The woman who named her turnips and mourned them before eating. And the preacher who prayed over every rotten egg like it was a feast sent from heaven. There was dignity, in a way. Dented, bruised dignity, but still present. Prisoners taught each other how to fold rags to filter water, how to scrape burnt bits off meat without losing too much, and how to breathe through your mouth when the stew smelled like old shoes. Dinner time, in 1786 prison life, wasn't a time of joy, but it was a time to survive, and in their own strange, quiet way, to endure. In many early American jails, cornmeal mush wasn't just a food, it was a philosophy. Served hot or cold, sometimes flavored with molasses, and often with little else on the plate, cornmeal mush was a staple for inmates across the 13 states. It was cheap, filling, and could be made in massive batches. But behind this bland and lumpy porridge was a much deeper story, one that tangled itself in class warfare, budget politics, and even race. Cornmeal was the grain of the poor. While wheat bread and white flour were associated with refinement and wealth, corn was seen as coarse, rural, and Indian. So, when authorities decided what to feed prisoners, cornmeal wasn't just a cost-saving measure, it was a statement. It reinforced the idea that prisoners were lesser people who didn't deserve the foods eaten by good citizens. For breakfast, a typical inmate might receive a ladle of mush, often unseasoned, placed into a wooden or pewter bowl. On days when the jailer was feeling generous, or the town budget allowed, there might be a small trickle of sorghum or molasses dripped on top. But many mornings were dry, with the mush served cold from the day before, hardened into a jello-like slab. Some prisoners grew so used to its blandness that they developed odd rituals around it, chewing it slowly to make it last, or shaping it into strange little sculptures before eating, simply to pass the time. In southern states like Virginia and Georgia, mush was sometimes paired with salted pork fat or beans. But these additions were rare luxuries, not daily norms. Salt pork was expensive and reserved only for Sundays, or for those inmates who had family willing to bribe the jailer. In northern towns like Boston or Providence, prisoners more often received bread crusts soaked in mushy porridge, less flavorful, but equally filling. Food wasn't just nourishment. It was a bargaining chip. In some jails, corrupt wardens deliberately withheld meals or diluted the mush with extra water to stretch rations and line their own pockets. In others, meals were used to reward obedience, extra molasses for a well-behaved prisoner, or a double portion for snitching on a troublemaker. But the worst abuse came when food became a weapon. Punishment diets, often used for those who broke the jail's rules, included nothing but stale cornmeal mush and water for days or even weeks. No salt. No molasses. Nothing warm. Just cold porridge scraped into a wooden bowl and left on the floor like slop. Some inmates, desperate to regain some control, refused to eat entirely. A silent protest. In response, some wardens simply let them starve. There were other protesters, too. Outside the jails, reformers and religious groups began raising questions by the 1790s. The Quakers, especially in Pennsylvania, were disturbed not only by the poor quality of food but by the cruelty with which it was distributed. They believed that all souls were redeemable, and that feeding someone with care was part of that redemption. One reformer wrote in 1792, "To feed a man as if he were an ox is to remind him daily that he is less than human. And what beast, treated like a beast, shall come to behave like a man?" This line was printed in several pamphlets and became something of a slogan for prison reformers. It challenged the growing American belief that harsh conditions built better men. And yet, mush persisted. Even as jails modernized and cities grew, Cornmeal stayed on the prison menu for decades. It was just too cheap to abandon. Cooks in larger penitentiaries like the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia would prepare it in cauldrons that could hold hundreds of pounds. In the winter, it was served steaming hot. In the summer, it was allowed to cool and cut into slabs like cornbread gone wrong. Prisoners often called it Yellow Death or the Brick, depending on how it was served. In some cells, fights broke out over molasses. Not because it was rare, but because a few drops could change the entire experience. A tiny bit of sweetness made the difference between dread and survival. Stories also circulated of inmates secretly trading or stealing small items, bits of butter, jam, or apple peel, from guards or visiting families, just to flavor the mush. One old prisoner wrote in a later memoir that he swore off cornmeal for life, and that even the smell of it decades later made him nauseous. The persistence of such a simple dish is haunting. Cornmeal mush was never intended to comfort. It was a daily reminder of punishment, of place, of power. It told the prisoner, with every spoonful, that he was forgotten, or worse, remembered only as a budget line. And that may have been the most bitter flavor of all. By the 1780s, even the concept of taste, something so ordinary, became entangled in prison philosophy. A prisoner's palate, if considered at all, was not a matter of pleasure but punishment. The food wasn't supposed to be good. It was supposed to be sufficient, repetitive, and emotionally numbing. One prison inspector in Pennsylvania wrote in 1786 that the meal schedule should be monotonous to the point of meditation. That's how oatmeal became a centerpiece of prison life, morning, noon, and night. But not the sweet kind. This was lumpy, watery, often cold, and served in dented tin bowls that retained the taste of iron. And yet, prisoners found small ways to reclaim humanity through food. They'd whisper recipes into each other's ears, imagine dishes they might have eaten in freedom. Apple pies, baked trout, warm cider with nutmeg. Of course, they had none of these things. But the talk of flavor became its own kind of rebellion. Guards didn't like that. One journal from New York's Bridewell prison describes how a warden confiscated mock recipe notes from inmates, treating them like contraband. The men had been scribbling recipes for non-existent feasts using charcoal and stolen paper scraps. They called it menu dreaming. In the women's quarters of a Boston jail, inmates found a different tactic, trading. One prisoner with a better sense of timing at mealtime, usually meaning she received a fresher ladle from the pot, would offer her warm mush in exchange for help with chores. Meals became currency. A better spoonful could buy you quiet, protection, or a blanket on a cold night. But what did these meals actually taste like? Surviving letters from inmates, mostly those who could read and write, give hints. One described the bread as burnt black on the outside, raw like glue within. Another likened the boiled beef to leather steeped in dishwater. Vegetables, when they appeared, were often rotting, onions with soft spots, potatoes with eyes growing from every side. In southern states like Virginia, where slavery and incarceration overlapped more openly, black prisoners were fed even worse. Slop buckets of leftover cornmeal, moldy okra, or weevil-infested rice were common. No effort was made to hide the dehumanization. A jail record from 1786 Charleston simply read, "Feed the Negroes once daily with scraps fit only for swine." These details weren't hidden. In fact, prison reformers used them as proof that the system was rotting from within. Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers and an early advocate for prison reform, argued that feeding prisoners rancid food only increased violence and madness. In one speech, he described American jails as factories of cruelty masquerading as discipline. His solution? A regulated menu. Rush proposed 3 meals a day, a porridge at dawn, bread and milk at midday, and a rotating vegetable stew for dinner. No meat, no spices, but clean, predictable. The prison, he argued, should not be a place of suffering, but of reflection. He believed bland food could encourage contemplation, and that starvation only bred bitterness. Some reformers agreed. Others scoffed. A prison matron in New Hampshire reportedly told Rush, "You cannot educate a thief with stew." Her jail continued serving the same salted fatback and black coffee, year after year. But slowly, reform began to spread. By the 1790s, Philadelphia's Walnut Street prison began testing a new approach. feeding prisoners in individual cells rather than in chaotic mess halls. The goal was silence. No talking. No sharing. Each inmate received a measured scoop of cornmeal mush, a hard biscuit, and a tin of weak broth. And it was quieter, but also lonelier. One visitor in 1799 noted that the inmates, when they did speak, talked only of food, and only in whispers. Even in punishment, hunger tied everyone together. Guards snuck crumbs to prisoners. Prisoners offered their bread to the sick. Sometimes, guards were punished themselves and forced to eat the same meals, to feel what discipline tastes like, as one warden wrote. And then there were the escapes. Not of people, but of meals. Some prisoners, given a bit of string and a spoon, would rig pulley systems from their cells, sending food from one barred window to another. A spoonful of warm stew could travel a dozen cells down, shared in silence. It was called the stew train. Eventually, wardens caught on. Windows were sealed tighter. Meals were monitored more closely. And yet, prisoners still dreamed. They dreamed of pies, of stews, of boiled apples and warm bread. In 1786, food in prison wasn't just sustenance. It was a reminder of what you'd lost, and maybe, what you still hoped for. For most prisoners in 1786, meals were daily reminders of punishment, monotony, and survival. But for those condemned to die, the prisoners waiting for their execution, food took on a different meaning. It was their last connection to the world of the living, a fleeting taste of mercy in an otherwise grim existence. The concept of a last meal wasn't standardized in American prisons of the 18th century. Yet, records from various jails show that some condemned prisoners were offered modest indulgences. Not grand feasts, mind you, there were no butter-drenched pies or roasted meats, but slightly better fare than the usual gruel and stale bread. In places like Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail, the warden sometimes allowed condemned men a hot meal, often prepared in the jail kitchen but served in their cells. A handful of salted pork, a warm bowl of stew thick with turnips and beans, and a small loaf of bread were common. For some, this meal was accompanied by a cup of weak cider or watered-down wine, a rare treat that brought fleeting warmth and comfort. These last meals held symbolic weight. They were tokens of mercy, perhaps intended to calm the soul or prevent the condemned from losing their minds in their final hours. Families occasionally petitioned for a bit of extra food or a favorite dish. Clergymen often blessed the meal, urging the prisoner to prepare for the afterlife. But the truth was harsher. Many condemned men rejected these meals outright. Hunger and grief had sapped their appetites. Some viewed eating as a betrayal of their fate, while others simply lacked the strength. A few, haunted by guilt or despair, spoke of seeing the food turn to ashes on their tongues. The prison staff often considered these last meals burdensome. Preparing even a slightly better meal took time and resources that jails could rarely spare. Some wardens grumbled that such indulgences encouraged prisoners to play the part of the doomed rather than face their sentences bravely. One record from 1786 New York noted a prisoner who, instead of eating, wrote letters to loved ones, asking for forgiveness and for small comforts to be sent after his death. While the condemned waited, their cells grew colder. The days slipped away, marked only by the arrival of the meager meals, reminders of both life and impending death. And yet, even in these final moments, food connected prisoners to a larger human story. It was a bridge between suffering and compassion, between justice and mercy. It reminded everyone, prisoner, guard, and visitor alike, that beneath the bars and shackles were fragile souls, craving not just survival, but dignity. By 1786, American prisons were little more than holding places where society deposited its undesirables. Their meals, simple, often revolting, and barely nourishing, reflected how little regard was given to those inside. Yet, for all their harshness, these meals held a mirror up to the evolving ideas of justice and punishment in a young nation. Food in prison was never just about hunger. It was about control, about reminding prisoners who held the power and who was powerless. Every coarse crust of bread, every thin scoop of mush, whispered a message. You belong here, in this place of suffering. And yet, amidst this cruelty, sparks of humanity glimmered. Some jailers, weary of brutality, made small efforts to improve meals. A handful of reformers pushed for better nutrition, believing that even prisoners deserved dignity. Community groups sometimes donated food or petitioned officials. Clergy ministers preached compassion and care, urging society to see prisoners as souls capable of redemption. Prison diaries and letters reveal small acts of kindness too. A fellow inmate sharing a piece of bread, a guard slipping an extra boiled potato to a sick man, a family member smuggling dried fruit. Still, the system remained harsh. Food shortages, corrupt officials, and indifferent authorities meant that many men and women spent months or years eating the same unchanging diet. Historians today look back at 18th century prison meals as more than just poor cooking or budget cuts. They see them as symbols of a time when punishment was designed to break bodies and spirits alike. But they also see resilience. Because prisoners, whether trapped by debt, crime, or political dissent, found ways to survive. They shared, traded, and sometimes dreamed. They turned bland mush into ritual, hunger into solidarity, and scarcity into stubborn hope. Their stories remind us that behind the cold bars, even the simplest meal carries weight. That food is never just food. It is memory, power, pain, compassion, and, sometimes, the faintest glimmer of freedom. If you thought prison meals just appeared magically at the cell door, think again. Behind every bowl of mush and every stale crust was a small, often chaotic world, the prison kitchen. In 1786, these kitchens were nothing like the bustling, stainless steel rooms we imagine today. Instead, they were cramped, smoky spaces, usually located in the basement or a corner of the jailhouse. The walls were blackened by soot, and the air smelled of ash, burnt meat, and stale sweat. Most prisons didn't employ professional cooks. Instead, the cooking duties were often assigned to prisoners themselves. Sometimes, well-behaved inmates were given the job as a privilege or a way to reduce their sentence. These kitchen slaves, as some called them, faced grueling work. They chopped firewood, fetched water from wells, and tended fires under massive iron cauldrons. The food was prepared in huge batches, often over open flames or in brick ovens. Cornmeal mush was boiled in kettles that could feed dozens at once, while bread was baked in simple, wood-fired ovens with little temperature control. Meat, usually salted pork or beef, was sometimes boiled until it turned rubbery, then sliced thinly to stretch it across many plates. Sanitation was minimal. Rats were common visitors, scurrying across counters or even into pots. Flies buzzed incessantly. The tools were primitive, wooden spoons blackened from years of use, iron pots warped from heat, and broken knives. The kitchen prisoners often faced suspicion from their fellows. Holding the keys to food meant power, a chance to hide morsels, to swap ingredients, or to play favorites. Rumors of stolen food and secret feasts occasionally led to fights. Sometimes, the jailer or the warden would inspect the kitchen to ensure the rations were distributed fairly. But oversight was rare, and corruption was common. A jailer might sell portions of meat to local taverns or skimp on firewood to save money. In some jails, families were allowed to bring food for their imprisoned relatives. These deliveries were precious lifelines but had to be inspected and could be seized. Sometimes, a fresh apple or a homemade pie would bring a brief moment of joy amid the endless cycle of mush and crust. The prison kitchen was a small world within a world, filled with its own hierarchies, secrets, and struggles. It was where survival took shape not just in hunger, but in power and control. And every meal served was a testament to those who endured the daily grind behind iron bars. Despite the grim conditions inside the walls, prison meals were not entirely disconnected from the outside world. Family members, friends, and local charity organizations often played a crucial role in supplementing the bare rations provided by jails. In 1786, many prisoners depended on food parcels brought by relatives during visits. These parcels might include fresh bread, salted meat, dried fruits, or even homemade stews wrapped in cloth. For those lucky enough to have supportive families, these gifts could mean the difference between survival and starvation. However, visits were rare and often tightly controlled. The process of delivering food involved inspections by jail officials who sometimes confiscated items they deemed too luxurious or contraband. Smuggling was common, small portions hidden in clothing hems, baskets, or even inside hollowed-out books. Charity also played a role. Religious groups, especially Quakers and other pietistic denominations, saw prison reform as a moral duty. They organized donations of food, blankets, and clothing to help ease the suffering of inmates. Some even volunteered as jail visitors, offering comfort and spiritual guidance alongside small treats or meals. Local communities sometimes held fundraising events to support poor prisoners, especially debtors who might otherwise starve while awaiting trial. Yet, this aid was uneven and often depended on the wealth and influence of the prisoner's family. Sadly, many inmates were utterly alone. Orphans, runaway servants, and the homeless rarely received outside help. Their meals consisted solely of the cold, repetitive mush and crust that defined prison fare. This reliance on outside charity exposed another layer of inequality in the justice system. Those with money or connections might taste fresh food. Those without faced endless hunger. The complex relationship between prison meals and family support highlights how justice and mercy intertwined in 18th century America, a world where survival sometimes depended on who you knew as much as what you'd done.